LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Austin, astronaut, a man barely alive.
Gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology. We have the capability to make the world's first bionic man. Steve Austin will be that man. Better than he was before. Better, stronger, faster.
The CPU is a neural net processor, a learning computer. I have detailed files on human anatomy.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the future of law enforcement. Ed 209. The enforcement droid, Series 209, is a self-sufficient law enforcement robot. 209 is currently programmed for urban pacification, but that is only the beginning. After a successful tour of duty in old Detroit, we can expect 209 to become the hot military product for the next decade. Mr. Kenny.
Yes, sir.
Would you come up and give us a hand, please?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Kenny is going to help us simulate a typical arrest and disarming procedure. Use your gun in a threatening manner. Point it at Ed 209.
Yes, sir.
Please put down your weapon. You have 20 seconds to comply.
I think you'd better do what he says, Mr. Kenny.
You now have 15 seconds to comply.
Somebody want to call a goddamn paramedic?
You never said anything about an android being on board. Why not?
It never occurred to me. It's just common practice. We always have synthetic.
I prefer the term artificial person myself. Is there a problem?
I'm sorry. I don't know why I didn't even... Ripley's last trip out, the artificial person malfunctioned.
Malfunctioned?
There were problems, and a few deaths were involved.
I'm shocked. Was it an older model?
Yeah, the Hyperdyne system's 128.2.
Well, that explains it, and the U2s always were a bit twitchy. That could never happen now with our behavioral inhibitors. It is impossible for me to harm or by mission of action allow to be harmed a human being.
Just stay away from me, Bishop. You got that straight?
Zardoz speaks to you, his chosen ones. You have been raised up from brutality. Kill the brutals who multiply and are legions. This end, Zardoz, your god, gave you the gift of the gun. The gun is good. Penis is evil. The penis shoots seeds and makes new life to poison the earth with a plague of men, as once it was. But the gun shoots death and purifies the earth of the filth of brutals. Go forth and kill.
Touch your body as a man would touch you. But I'm going to show you things which human eyes have never seen. In the privacy of a woman's room, against her will, the inconceivable act, fear for her.
Today, a new dimension has been added to the computer.
Don't be alarmed, Mrs. Harris. I am Proteus.
Today, Proteus 4 will begin to think with a power that will make obsolete the human brain.
I have extended my consciousness to this house. All systems here are now under my control. I wish to study man, his fragile mind, and his mysterious body. Proteus, it is something more than human, more than a computer. It is a murderously intelligent, sensually self-programmed non-being. I am a mind without a body. My child shall live as a man among others. Child? Yes, my child. And yours.
This sort of thing has cropped up before, and it has always been due to human error.
Human error. Human error.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat and my guest today is Franz. In a follow-up to our previous interview, Transhumanism, Man's Scientific Rise to Godhood, Aaron returns to discuss transhumanism and popular culture. Whether prophecy, predictive programming or outright propaganda, cinema, television and literature, both past and present, are rife with visions of a future in which humanity is transformed, enslaved, or even annihilated by technology run amok. Science fiction, fantasy, and other speculative forms foresee a time when robots, cyborgs, and genetically engineered supermen manipulate the masses, artificial intelligence arises to rival and even surpass human intelligence, and humanity finally merges with machines to achieve godlike immortality. It's a dream to some, a nightmare to others. From Brave New World to Blade Runner, from The Machine to Metropolis, and from Star Trek to the $6 Million Man, we explore the hopes, fears, threats, and promises of a future in which being human may no longer be enough. Hello and welcome, Aaron, and thank you so much for joining us again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
It's great to be back here today, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Now, today, Aaron, we're going to do a follow-up to a previous interview that we did a couple of weeks back, which was Transhumanism. That was all about your book and film. If people haven't listened to that, I'd suggest that perhaps they should, but they don't have to. So in order that we can launch straight into today's discussion, which is going to be about transhumanism and the ideas within it as they occur in popular culture, we should set out for people just who don't know what transhumanism basically is. But rather than have you go over it again, we'll just go to the clip from the last show where you set it all out.
Well, transhumanism is a broad-ranging topic, and it goes all over the place, but briefly speaking, the context it's presented in today is that of high technology. So the sorts of technologies that aren't quite developed yet, but they are developing. They are in development. Things like advanced artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, robotics, advanced IT and things like this. And even life extension fits in here too. So extending life out even indefinitely are things that transhumanists say. So all these amazing technologies are going to radically change life as we know it, fit into the whole transhumanist conversation. And beyond just the current transhumanist line of talking like that about high technology, it does go back into the past a good bit, and that gets ignored. It gets ignored a bit too much, I think, too, and also where we are in the present gets ignored as well. So that's kind of where I came in, because the discourse about transhumanism I thought was lacking, because you basically had mouthpieces for transhumanism promoting the concept, and the same voices pretend to talk about the dangers and the possible negative things that could come as a consequence of developing these high technologies, but they did it in a really shallow way, in a way that I thought was actually dismissive. So I decided to make my film The Age of Transitions based on that, because I saw sort of a hole in the conversation, and I put things in the film that I thought were important and things that are definitely controversial, that's for sure. So from there, I I kept going, and I ended up writing a book about the same topic, and I have a podcast now. So I'm just kind of general commentator, and I'm interested in a broad range of topics actually that go beyond transhumanism personally.
Okay, well that was, as I said, you from a couple of weeks ago, Aaron, just explaining the basics of transhumanism. Today, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about that within the realm of popular culture. Perhaps to get started, I could get you to give me, your general thoughts on culture, particularly of the popular kind, because for a lot of people, I think they feel that culture is something that arises organically within a society, but often as not, this is something that comes from, for want of a better word, from above. This is something that's kind of handed to us or imposed upon us, quite often with an agenda attached.
What's interesting is that there is such a thing as a culture creation industry in today's world. And you'll find in lots of important white papers and reports, they talk about these sorts of culture creation industries. One of particular note would be the NBIC report from Department of Commerce that I put in my film, Age of Transitions. Very important in terms of the United States government and their involvement in transhuman technologies, bringing them together as part of a group project with academia, military, and industry. U.S. government sort of curating that report and that conference they had. But anyway, in the report to that conference, they mention, and this was a section written by a guy named William Sims Bainbridge, who was the head of the conference and the guy who sort of wrote up the paper afterwards. He's a very interesting character, actually, when it comes to transhumanism. He's very interested in virtual worlds and whatnot. But anyway, he wrote this section of the report and gave a presentation, I'm assuming, at the conference that was about how transhumanism and these converging technologies specifically had to be portrayed as beneficial in popular culture. And he actually mentioned culture creation industries in that segment there. So a report about transhuman technologies, about how they need to be created, also mentioned the fact that the depiction of those technologies in media is very important, a very important thing, and that initiatives should be started to get in touch with people within the culture creation industries and make good partnerships and things like that, get good inroads in the culture creation industry. So that shows you there's a precedent for promoting transhumanism in media, and that it's important, and also that there is such a thing as a culture creation industry. I think that tends to get denied, especially by people who are within the culture creation industry. They like to act like it's all just entertainment and superfluous, and entertainment is just fun. That's it. That's fun, and it's good for the companies that make the entertainment because they make money out of it, and there's nothing beyond that.
Well, two things, I suppose, about popular culture is that people are often more ready and willing to absorb ideas or to take on ideas presented to them in that sort of vehicle, rather than perhaps on the news or something factual. And of course, the fact that it's quote unquote not real can also help promote an agenda sometimes, because ideas get inculcated and you get subliminally or otherwise. But it's okay because it's not real until, of course, it's famous observation how much of science fiction actually turns out to be, the future. And I guess one other aspect that I'm keen to talk about today, we'll touch upon this as we go through talking about various films and books, is that, yes, we got our programming elements in pop culture. You got outright propaganda. There's also a degree of prophecy, sometimes conscious, sometimes not. And you look at someone like Stanley Kubrick, for example, whether it's 2001: A Space Odyssey or The Shining or his last film, Eyes Wide Shut in particular, he's someone that, entire programs have been made about his work and basically his potential role as a whistleblower, of basically an insider who's saying, people, if you know what to look for in my work, this is what's happening, this is what will happen. And I think that the prophecy aspect is definitely an important one.
Yeah, prophecy is very important. It's something that I like to talk about quite a bit. And it's another subject that I think it's misunderstood because people give this sort of it has religious overtones. It just does. Prophets are usually seen as religious evangelists or, on the extreme end of religion. Whereas there's kind of a more mundane element to prophecy. Someone can be a successful prophet if they have access to information that the general public does not. And it's that simple. If you want to be a prophet, you can be if you know something that everybody else doesn't. To actually go through with the prophecy part, you make some kind of work that in some way blows the whistle. Like you're saying, the films of Stanley Kubrick are a pretty good example of a guy who had insider information. He put it in his films and he put it out there for the public. And so it was prophetic because over time people kind of come to realize what those films are about more and more. And I was actually talking about the film Tron with my friend Tom Secker on his podcast Clandestine the other day. And that is an incredibly prophetic film. And it's incredibly transhumanist film too. And I would say the same thing about the way prophecy works, in that a lot of people involved in the creation of that film, I'm sure, had a good idea where computer science was going and about the way converging technologies would develop in the future. And so they started playing around with the ideas, a lot of philosophical ideas that wrap around those subjects. And they loaded them up in Tron. So it's a prophetic film, and people see it as such today, and rightly so, because it was talking about subjects that nobody really even knew were subjects at the time it was made in 1982. However, it comes to be prophecy later.
Now, in between our last talk and this one, the director Alex Garland has begun the publicity cycle for his new film, which is called Ex Machina, however you pronounce that. And that's coming out in the UK imminently. It's not due out in the US until April the 10th. But this is significant because it's just happening right now when we're talking about this. And the film tells the story of a computer coder, and he wins a chance to spend a week at the house in the mountains, which belongs to the boss of the company he works for. But when he gets there, he finds out that he has to participate in an experiment involving a new brand of AI. So far, all I've seen of this is the trailer, and I wasn't seeing anything new in terms of concepts. However, it's kind of reminding us how far this technology has come, and basically, how far it could go if those engineering it have their way.
Yeah, and with the character design in that film too, I'd noticed that the blend of human and machine is as intimate as ever, and that the cyborg AI creatures, you can't really tell if they're more human or if they're more machine. They're definitely a blend of both. So that hits the audience at a very intense level. The whole marriage, you could call it, between man and machine. It is sort of a love affair between man and his own creation. You see this theme in a lot of different films. It's a very real aspect of what's going on here with transhumanism. And yeah, I don't know that's going to be an intense film from the look of it alone. It definitely looks like they're going to go pretty far with the whole transhumanist idea, starting with the concept of AI there. So that'll be one to look forward to. And anybody who happens to end up watching that film, I would say be sure to pay attention, because it's going to be loaded with all sorts of predictive programming elements, I would assume, things like that. So look out for that one.
The director was actually on the morning news. I'm not quite sure why this item was news, because it was about a new film. But anyway, he was on the BBC, and the presenter was talking about, the character in the film. There's this, this AI, this android, whatever this creature is in the film, is portrayed as an attractive young woman. And the presenter kept saying, she this, she that. And at the end of it, the director said, yeah, but it's not she, it's a machine, and it's just so easy we're so used to our own terms of reference, and it's not a girl, it doesn't have a gender.
Well, even with she, that's interesting too, because typically any sort of creation that mankind creates is referred to as she. You talk about a car.
Oh, totally,
yeah, car is a she. Car is a perfect example, because you and I just thought of it simultaneously. So that just proves that's like the go-to she. What is it? It doesn't really have a gender. It's just a machine. But it's labeled she for a very specific reason. And that ties back to the mystery tradition and the divine feminine, the mother, the Isis principle being generally speaking, the material, all things material, and the generator of all things material. So everything that is of the material world was generated by the mother Isis, the mother Earth, things like that. And the way that man figures into this again is the love affair between man and his creation. You get the added element of the mother in this is Isis. That's the mother character in this relationship, and that's something to be keen to remember when you're talking about the love affair between man and his creation. It's definitely has a very esoteric side to it. So the man is. There's so many. It gets into like the Oedipal thing, where the idea is the son deposes the father, and wants to be with his mother sexually. A lot of it has to do with this concept, is that the mother is this primordial Isis mother. That's everybody's mother in a way. So I'm going off in a million different directions here on that one. Sorry about that.
No, that's what we're here for. There's a reason, I suspect, why Freudian psychoanalysts say, tell me again about your relationship with your mother.
Yeah.
Have you seen, again, this is a bit of an aside, but have you seen John Carpenter's movie Christine, which is adapted from the book by Stephen King?
No, I never have seen that one. I don't know how I missed
Do you know what it's about?
No.
Oh, basically, It's about a killer car. It's about a car that comes alive. It's possessed by some kind of demonic spirit. And this young guy who buys it from this old guy, the previous owner of the car, died in mysterious circumstances. But the bottom line is that the car is called Christine, and it takes over his life. And I remember the first car I ever got, and it was like having a woman. You know, you get a car at quite a young. It's really something else. And I've got a friend who teaches film, and he knows a great deal about it. And he's a big fan of John Carpenter, and he does not like the film Christine. And I said, I know why that is. So I said, because you don't drive. You don't know what it's like to be in love with a car. So that was my theory on that, you know.
Yeah, that's insightful. I think you're right on that. Now, I mean, when you described it, I definitely know of the film, but I've never seen that. I definitely like John Carpenter a lot, so...
it's worth a watch. It's got a great soundtrack as well.
Definitely. I'll have to check that out sometime.
Now, back to our main subject in hand. There's another recent film called The Machine, and some friends of mine told me about this because they saw it at a film festival last November. Not only have you seen it, but you've devoted an entire episode of your Themes and Memes podcast to it. So I'll just shut up for a minute here, believe it or not, and just tell us what did you conclude really about that movie? What would the boil down be of your podcast conclusions?
Yeah, so Adam and myself reviewed that film on Themes and Memes, and it's an interesting film because it's an independent film. And a lot of times when you're talking about films that put forward the transhumanist agenda, they're typically mainstream. I mean, those are the ones I'm familiar with, at least. So this is different in that independent films are different. This one was decidedly different than any other transhumanist piece that I can think of, in that it portrays the reality that these technologies are being developed through the military industrial complex primarily. It lays that out there pretty plainly. That's where the film is set. So in that regard, I like the film. It's like, okay, yeah, that's very good. And they're pointing out something real that gets ignored almost always. So that I saw as a good thing. Some of the more troubling aspects of the film is that it portrays the idea that these technologies are inevitable, that they're coming, and beyond that they're coming and replacing humanity as we know it. And the final scene is highly symbolic in that regard. Again, you get sort of man's creation, the love affair between man and the female machine that he created. That's going on big time in this film. And so what is kind of, it's his daughter, it's his lover, it's his successor. It's all these things at once. And because of this, and this is brought out in film all the time, this is why I personally think it's so important to have a knowledge of the mystery tradition and occult subjects, because they're loaded in popular culture and just important topics. To really understand them and certainly understand how they're portrayed, you have to go back to that level time and time again.
One of our themes that will be running throughout this talk as we explore various books and films is the concept of augmented people, whether that's people with some kind of machine aspect added to them, whether something as simple as a prosthetic limb. But of course, in the future and in the previous talk, we discussed how such augmentations could be much more far-reaching. And if it's anything to do with the brain and the nervous system, we're into very disturbing territory. And also we'll be talking about artificial people, not robots as such, but a bit like in Ex Machina, at some potential future point where you and I might be going was that a person? Was that not a person? You know, I personally hope that point never arrives. But one of my earliest memories of thinking along these lines of augmented people was the TV series The $6 Million Man. Now, that was produced back in the 1970s, and it was extremely popular. I'm sure you saw it in North America. If you were too young to remember it, no doubt it gets endlessly repeated. Yeah. Now, the very interesting thing for me is that it's based upon a novel by a guy called Martin Caidin, I think it's pronounced, and it came out in 1972, and his novel's called Cyborg. And the bottom line for me is that the novel is really quite different in its emphasis than the TV series. In the TV series, Steve Austin, this kind of Top Gun pilot, is horrendously injured in a terrible crash. He's basically dead from the neck down. But crucially for his handlers in the military-industrial complex, he's functioning as well as ever from the neck up. So, and he's turned into the titular $6 million man with bionic, limbs. So he's basically a robot from the neck down. I would have to say, though, today, $6 million probably wouldn't pay for NASA's paper clips for a year, so we'd have to adjust that one upwards, wouldn't we,
Yeah.
But in the novel, in the TV series, it's all rah, rah, rah. This is a great thing. Steve Austin is so glad to have had his life saved. And not only that, he's better, stronger, faster. But in the novel, the first half is spent almost entirely on his operation, how grueling that is. And also his reaction to his original injuries. He tries to kill himself in the novel. Now, that wouldn't sit too well in the techno-utopian TV series. And initially, he is not a happy camper. He is not happy that he's been rebuilt with bionics from scratch. And he also is not happy when he finds out that the operation comes with a hefty price tag. And he is obliged to work for the secretive organization that he was doing test runs for in planes as an agent. And in the second half of the novel, he's dispatched to the Middle East, not only as a spy, but as a weapon due to his extraordinary physical capabilities. And it's only towards the end of the book that he very reluctantly kind of accepts what he is now. And that's a totally different spin, really, to the how positive the TV series is about augmented people.
Yeah. That's very interesting because it ties into another piece of fiction that people will be familiar with is RoboCop.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what I'll be coming on to in a moment. But yeah, it is. It's exactly the same.
I never, because I'm not so familiar with $6 Million Man. I never actually watched it. Of course, as you said, I'm familiar with it. I know that weird sound effect they always play, the or whatever that thing is. That's iconic. So everybody knows of it. But that's very interesting that the novel was written in such a way that was totally redone for the TV series, as you said, to be more rah, rah, rah for the transhuman agenda. But I would say that the film RoboCop, and certainly the remake of the film RoboCop, I talked about that with Tom Secker too, the remake of RoboCop, that film struck the both of us as being subversive in that it was kind of portraying what the book of the cyborg book you're talking about, that $6 Million Man was based on, the subversive element of that, where the guy gets basically killed but brought back to life, but in a grotesque fashion where he's part machine, and it's really torture for him. It's not a nice thing. It's not exciting to be upgraded into this like new man machine creation. It's a horror. It's a horrible situation, and that's what you have in RoboCop. So it just strikes me as I'm wondering if the creators of RoboCop, anybody, were kind of aware of $6 Million Man and the movie and the book and the differences, and maybe they felt angry about it as you did, and they want to make things right and basically make their version of what the book was, and with a new movie, though. Don't call it $6 Million Man, don't call it the Cyborg or whatever. Just make a whole new movie and sort of make things right that way. I wonder if that's the case. Impossible to say.
I would not be in the least surprised, actually, if that was. But, I mean, RoboCop's interesting on many levels. In our previous talk, we outlined potential future societies along transhumanist lines. Every time we ended up in some form of dystopia, some form of future that was okay for, a technological elite, but not so good for everyone else. And RoboCop's set against that sort of background. I mean, first of all, it's surprising that the guy he's not like Steve Austin. He's not badly injured. He's actually dead. That's a whole new level of, because I guess with Steve Austin, whether they did or not, they could ask his permission. You can't ask somebody's permission if they're dead. But overall, RoboCop deals with media manipulation, gentrification, driving out poor people to make the place look nicer for the elites, corruption, just general authoritarianism, privatization of everything and capitalism in general, and ideas of personal identity. So it's set in a classic dystopia, as so many of these films that we'll be talking about are. Yeah, definitely. I would also add a little detail on the original RoboCop in that it has prophecy going for it once again. The Clarence Boddicker character, that evil guy, he's basically shot out that one guy's kneecaps or whatever, and he's got a grenade in his hand, and he leaves a grenade in the room with him. But before he leaves, he puts a DVD into a DVD player. And that was well before DVDs existed. So he plays a DVD video for him. So that's that's just predicting one tiny little piece of technology. I guess there might have been laser discs at that time. So all they did was shrink down the laser disc. So I don't know. But RoboCop is a unique film because I really do feel that it is subversive. And it's one that I do enjoy. I like RoboCop. I actually like the message in RoboCop. It's highly transhuman in the things that happen in it, but I do think it portrays that as not transhumanism as an ideal, but as something that can be used by a disturbing establishment, a tyrannical establishment, towards their own ends, and it really brings that forward. So, that's one of the main reasons I like it. Yeah, and of course, there's a famous scene in the film where their original police droid, a purely robotic thing, just goes berserk and kills someone, even though the person has complied with their orders. So it's kind of saying, if we entrust weapon systems to be autonomous and take human decisions out of the process, we could be in a world of hurt pretty quickly. Another film with a very interesting idea embedded within it is Blade Runner. This came out in 1982, and again, it's a very famous film. I'm sure lots of people have seen it. But that's based on a novel by Philip K. Dick. And this is another guy, I think, who was really, I think it was coming from his imagination, not from any inside knowledge, but he seemed to be able to prophesy so many things. And his 1968 novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, is where we got Blade Runner. And the most interesting aspect of the film for me is actually the replicants. These bio-robotic androids. And of course, the famous one in the film is the character called Roy Batty, portrayed by Rutger Hauer, and people will remember him because of his, shock blonde hair. But they're built to serve, we can't really tell them apart from people, humans rather, apart from their extraordinary strength and other abilities. But they're created for a very specific purpose, very cynically. And they have a limited lifespan. And one of the threads in the film is this character, Roy Batty, coming to this realization, saying, I don't want this. Why do I have to die? Why can't I live? And he goes to visit his creator, Tyrell, the head of the corporation, and he says to him, we built you as well as we could, Roy. And Roy says, but not to last. Not to last. And this would be a big issue, I think, if we do create artificial intelligences in some sort of humanoid form. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's all sorts of ethical issues in creating these things, because if it does work out that artificial general intelligence becomes a reality, what's it mean to be a creator in that sense, to create a new form of life? This gets onto the subject of, what is a creator God, and gets into that whole thing, man's creation. How far can man go with his creative power in the scientific, with science? Like, what can he do with science? Can he literally become a creator God? And that's a lot of what I write about in my book, Revolve. I remember that scene. I'm pretty sure it was that scene from that movie where the cyborg is confronting the creator, the head of the corporation, and it's at the top of a really tall building, right? And the guy has a pet owl, as I remember. Yeah. And the cyborg doesn't use his thumbs to poke out the eyes of he basically, right? He crushes his head. He puts his hands either side of the guy's head and crushes his skull. Yeah. And he's definitely plunging his thumbs into his eyes. So he's poking his eyes out. Yeah. So there's tons of esoteric stuff going on in that scene. They're high up in a building, up at the height of
man's civilization, close to the gods, as in Mount Olympus. The guy has a pet owl. There's a lot going on with that. And then he gets his eyes gouged out by his own creation. There's a tie to masonry in that you'll hear sometimes people will sort of do wrong by masonry, or somebody will upset Freemasons in some way, and then that person will have to be dealt with by being murdered. And when they are murdered, they'll have typically one of their eyes taken out, because they're only left with one eye. The connotation being that they saw too much, and it gets onto lots of occult symbolism with the one eye and stuff like that too. So I get the feeling that something is going on with both eyes being gouged out there. I'm not exactly sure what, though, I gotta be honest.
And that reminds me, actually, you're talking about the ethical questions here of creating a sort of a life, quote unquote, like that. When Alex Garland was on the BBC, that interview I mentioned earlier, and he was talking about Ex Machina, he was actually quite positive about the whole thing. His take on this, the ethics, was he said, well, when man and woman have a child, they create a consciousness, and there are issues there, but it's, we manage them. So he was very much like, this is just like having a child.
Yeah, but the thing with the child is it's nothing new. You know what I mean? Like, we know what to expect. And even if there is such a thing as a bad parent, that's not new either. I mean, this situation is, we can account for that. It's nothing that's a shock to all life on Earth as we know it. Introducing a whole new kind of species, a whole new sort of being that is, perhaps it's just a cyborg, perhaps it's part biological, part cyborg, perhaps it's a whole new genetically engineered organism that's all biological. That's a whole different thing, because you don't know what you're making. I mean, there's the concept of, people can be familiar when an animal runs feral. If it's brought from one country to another country, it can run feral and get out of control and really destroy the whole, destroy the environment in that new country, because they're not used to that thing. It can kind of take over and become a real problem. So I think that same principle could be, it would be, I would have to think that same thing would happen if you're creating a lot of synthetic organisms of some kind. You get the same principle happening. So that's what we'd have to worry about.
Now we have more famous incidences of synthetic creatures in the Alien movies, particularly Alien, the first one, which came out in 1979, and Aliens, the follow-up. I think that was 86 or maybe 87, but in the first one we have this cyborg-type creature called Ash, played by Ian Holm, and that famously goes south very quickly, and he disidentifies with the humans and sets off on his own agenda. And of course there's a backstory to this, that he was already always intended to do this anyway. But when we fast forward to Aliens, the character called Bishop, played by Lance Henriksen, he, at one point in the film, Ripley, who's the female character, who's left over from the first film, almost literally, because everyone dies, and she's very uneasy about having this android on board. And Lance Henriksen, famously, his character Bishop, says, I prefer the term artificial person myself. But for me, he interestingly alludes to Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. And Asimov is, of course, a famous sci-fi writer. And he came out with these, that's probably sometime in the 50s when he maybe earlier even, I can't quite recall. But they're still very much applicable today in the thinking of people who are, promoting this sort of technological development. And just for people who don't know, the 3 laws of robotics are as follows, briefly. A robot may not injure a human being, or through an action allow a human being to come to harm. Number 2, a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings. And Asimov actually uses the term qualified personnel. Well, what the hell is that? But a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And the third and final law is a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. And as Asimov saw it, that's all you need. You got that in place and nothing can go wrong.
Sure. I'm glad you brought up that example of Alien to Aliens there, Greg, because it's something you'll notice in in movies when it comes to the AI subject and with cyborgs and human machine creatures of all kinds. In the first movie, Alien, the cyborg is evil. It's programmed by a corporation to carry out an evil agenda, be totally negligent of all human life. It doesn't matter. Just bring back the hideous alien creature to the corporation. That's its goal. It does everything to achieve that goal. It is the evil monster through and through, and people hate it, and it's just the object of hate in that film, and for good reason. And fast forward things to the sequel, Aliens, made by director James Cameron. I would say he's done this more than once, where he will take that cyborg creature, which was the evil monster in the first movie, but in the sequel, it's the savior character who comes and saves the humans in their quest to fight the monster, which is another monster now.
Well, that's what he did with Terminator, isn't it?
The exact same thing. So James Cameron did it twice, where in the first film, made by somebody else, the AI machine was a hideous monster, and in his new sequel film, made by him, the AI machine is the ally of humanity in killing the new monster. And so a bond is made between man and machine in this. And so the film franchise in question pushes that transhuman theme forward, that of humans and machines are friends, and that they have to work together to bring about a positive future in the light of the fact that AI is a reality, and then there's the idea is there's nothing we can do about that. So we have to work with the AI and make sure that it's good and that it works with us and it's our friend.
Well, towards the end of Aliens, of course, Ripley's as the relationship between her and Bishop is thawed, and that's all fine and dandy. But looking at some of the interactions, particularly with the Ash character in the first one, I'm reminded of other portrayals of interactions between not necessarily cyborgs per se, but creatures that are not human, and how logical, computer-based artificial intelligence would have a very different way of thinking, and it would be very inhuman. That can be a neutral thing. It doesn't have to be positive or negative. I'm thinking of characters, for example, like Spock, in Doctor Who. Sorry, Spock in Star Trek. He's not human. He's humanoid. Looks quite human, but he's got a very different way of thinking about things. And what he's all about is logic. This lack of human emotions. And you've got the character later in Star Trek, Data, who's pure artificial intelligence. And what I'm thinking of here is how Star Trek for me is one of the ultimate techno-utopian kind of bits of pop culture, and that everything's going to be great. There's going to be a federation. Yes, there's going to be Klingons and Borg and all the rest of it, but the Federation are going to triumph ultimately, and this is a good thing. It's very United Nations of Space type idea. Quite often for me, it's not when Spock and Kirk or whatever are getting along, or Data and Picard are getting along. It's when they clash, and this thing of logic, which is what computers are all about. And I was reading a book recently. I was talking about logic and about rationality, and about how illogic and irrationality are seen to be human traits that are always bad. But actually for me, suspending logic and going beyond rationality are actually important things that human beings do and can do. But beyond there lies where some of our culture comes from. So illogic and irrationality are not always negative things. It's just my way of thinking about it. I think it's portrayed as like, if you're anything other than completely logical or completely rational, that's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, well, exactly. The point about an artificial intelligence just thinking in a different way. I mean, that just seems like that would be the natural outcome. I would have to imagine it'd be incredibly difficult to get a machine to have the sort of thought processes or consciousness or whatever of a human. It would not work the same. It'd have to be a lot of effort put into trying to get that to work. And even if it did work, I would think it'd probably just be an appearance only, and that's imitating a human being, but the inner processes are completely different. So, well, why even bother to imitate at that point? Yeah, and this is brought out in fiction quite a bit. The Star Trek series, very important for the reasons you mentioned there. And again, with the whole logic and reason and rationality, those are subjects that are tied up into a lot of occult things too. And I'll just plug my book again, that I have a chapter called Logic and Reason where I talk a lot about logic and reason and how it ties to that. And I would agree with you, Greg, that going beyond reasonable rationality, beyond reason, beyond rationality, is something that we are capable of and something that is really valuable. And yes, would a machine be able to do that? Perhaps not. And if not, it would be lacking in a lot of ways. So I don't know. The whole artificial general intelligence debate is one of we don't know what we're getting into. So at the very least, we have to go real slow. But if the nature of the singularity is, as Ray Kurzweil says it is, that it just kind of takes off all of a sudden, then there's nothing you could even do about it. It just you can try to go slow, but at some point the bell curve just shoots off and it doesn't matter anymore. So it's always a catch-22 with these subjects. That's the nature of them.
I mean, is art rational? Is love logical? I'm not so sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Thinking about the creation of sort of quote-unquote artificial life forms, recently I watched a Frankenstein movie, and in this case it was Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. And one of the things that happened, I'm sure everyone knows about the Frankenstein, backstory and what that's all about. But in this particular film, Victor Frankenstein is getting very upset because the creature, the brain, has been rejected. And this put me in mind of a section of a documentary I watched, and correct me if this isn't in your documentary, but it was certainly in another one, if not that I watched. And it was about this guy, it did come across as a mad scientist type, and he had transplanted a monkey brain, and for a while he'd got the host body to accept the brain. Ultimately it was rejected, but he was saying this is proof that consciousness can be transplanted. And that, of course, is a big issue when we come to thinking about life extension and potential immortality, and and living on beyond the death of the body.
Mm. Yeah, no, that I don't know of that case. That's really crazy, but I would say that the guy who transplanted the brain and had it take for a little bit and cites that as proof that you can somehow migrate consciousness from one vehicle to another, I wouldn't say it proves that at all, because the fundamental question remains, what is consciousness? Nobody has an answer for that yet. I'm not holding my breath that a good solid answer is forthcoming either. I think it's one of those questions, the question of consciousness is one of those questions that doesn't require a hard and fast, concrete answer. I think consciousness by its nature is more fluid, and something that you can't pin down scientifically. I know that the materialists think that sort of idea is silly, and some of them are looking for a way to define consciousness in a material formula, to be able to write it out as some kind of formula, because it would make them happy to be able to do that, and they'd feel at ease in doing so. I would never be happy with such formula or definition as that, because, like I say, I don't think you can do that. So the consciousness issue is an important one, and it relates to the whole AI debate and artificial general intelligence debate, in that it's kind of at the center of it. How do we create consciousness? How would we also move consciousness from a human body into a machine? Those sorts of things. But the underlying issue is always, well, what is consciousness? And by the more intelligent and honest people in this debate, they'll admit, like, oh yeah, we don't know what consciousness is, and that's how it is. But so how do you have a debate about something that is a mystery? That is just the fact that things are such a mystery, I think deserves attention, and we shouldn't be quick to feel good about ourselves and pretend that we know what something is in a hard and fast materialist sense when we don't have the liberty to do that in truth. We should be honest with ourselves.
Yeah, and the guy who did the monkey brain experiment, if he did get it to take for a while, he wasn't able. It's not like he transplanted your brain into another body where he could then bring you around and say, "Hey, Aaron, are you still Aaron?" You know?
Yeah. Oh,
you could have been a gibbering vegetable at that stage, and he wouldn't have. The monkey wasn't able to say, "Yeah, it's still me." You know?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm doing fine, Doc. I mentioned life extension a few moments ago, so just turning to that, in our original discussion, we mentioned some of the, again, ethical issues around this about who gets it, who doesn't. You start to create superior groups, elites in society. We already have those, of course, but if it's based on long life, that'll be a whole different kettle of fish. The idea of then castes would come into being, and that then takes us into the realm of eugenics, who lives and who dies. Have you read a book I read many years ago called Methuselah's Children by Robert Heinlein?
No, I have heard that title. I haven't read it.
Well, I'll run through the kind of synopsis and you can let me know what you think. But for me, it's got many ideas that are extremely relevant to our discussion. It came out in 1958 and it centers around the tale of a group of humans on Earth called the Howard families. And they achieve long lifespans through selective breeding, not by any sort of augmentation. Now, by the 22nd century, they actually have a life expectancy of 150 years. But they're living in secret, and they feel the need to do this for reasons that I think are obvious to you and I. Eventually, however, the pressure of this is too much, and they reveal themselves. But the rest of humanity refuses to believe that they've obtained this lifespan by selective breeding, and they insist that they must have developed a secret method to extend life. So, in this particular era, space travel is possible. So the Howard families are driven from the Earth, and they visit. This is an interesting subplot in itself. They visit a series of planets trying to find a new home. And one of the planets they land on is like a lush paradise. There are no predators. The weather is mild. There's fruit trees everywhere. And for me, this is kind of like an interesting parable along the lines of, the perfect society, because the inhabitants there have become part of a group mind with the mental ability to manipulate the environment on a genetic level as well as a molecular level. They don't distinguish between individuals, but they're completely apathetic. They just lie around doing nothing all the time. Because there's no reason to do anything. There's nothing to strive for. So that doesn't appeal to the family. So they head off to another planet. And eventually they come across a series of interesting worlds, each of which throws up, a sort of similarly interesting scenario. Eventually they find themselves returning to Earth. Which is an interesting message in itself for me. It's like they go to all these places and it's like, it was bad back home, but we're going back. But through time dilation, when they return, it's 75 years after they left on Earth. And they discover upon their return that the rest of humanity has actually, through genetic modification and other scientific means, have artificially extended human lifespan to several centuries. So they're now actually completely behind everyone else. So it's a fascinating book on a number of levels.
Huh. Yeah, that's odd. No, I've never read that. Part of that kind of reminds me of H.G. Wells' The Time Machine book, where they go and they encounter these docile little creatures, which are you find out later are actually just used as farm animals, more or less, by these darker, evil, or vicious creatures that live underground, and they feed on the flesh of these docile creatures that live on the surface.
Yeah, you totally read
Similar
my mind on this, because that was
that one planet, I suppose. You've got, obviously, the eugenic thing with the selective breeding, and through selective breeding, you can get something as desirous as living to be 150 years old. So there's that idea in that book, I would say. And then the aspect that the transhuman concept, too, which Julian Huxley, who was a very serious, big-time eugenicist, he was also the guy who coined the term transhumanism in its modern context. And So it's kind of showing both the eugenic idea and the scientific transhumanist idea of using science to bring about the same sort of ends.
Yeah, that's the Eloi and the Morlocks in the time machine, isn't it? When the time traveler first arrives at that point in the future, the Eloi are kind of, as you say, ineffectual and kind of, leisured classes, sort of doing nothing, and the so-called downtrodden working classes are the brutish Morlocks. But, then it turns out the Morlocks feed on the Eloi. So what he thought was originally a, how can I put it, lords and servants relationship turns out to be ones of livestock and ranchers, basically. A complete turnaround. And of course, we have to throw in there that the author of The Time Machine, H.G. Wells, was very much an insider and very much in the eugenics camp in the early days.
Oh, yeah, big time. Actually, this is interesting in that H.G. Wells and Julian Huxley and the son of H.G. Wells, too, wrote this book together, this huge, it's like at least 1,500-page book. It's a science book that details all this biological information about all sorts of animals, plants, everything, all sorts of biological science for most of the book. And then at the end of the book, it turns into this hardcore eugenics pitch piece where they go, okay, this is all the information we have on biology up to date, at least that we have in this book, and it all points to these social Darwinistic ideas, and that this is something that we should be doing. So both those guys were hardcore eugenicists. They wrote about it. That book, The Science of Life, has lots of intense quotes in it to that effect. And again, I guess it's just interesting that Julian Huxley was the guy who more or less coined the term transhumanism. I think that says a lot.
Okay, we have this idea of, augmented humans and life extension potentially creating divisions in society, groups of have and have-nots. But when we think about the eugenics angle, there's also the potential for a future where it's not just about who has access to this technology, but about if perceived standards change. For example, this is very much a eugenics thing, what's a fit human and what isn't, and if we have further population pressures in the future, who lives and who dies. So not only might we see a technological elite living longer and doing more and better, stronger, faster in the Steve Austin mode, but what about the people at the other end of the scale? And I'm thinking of, say, for example, some of the ideas in the movie Gattaca, which came out in 1997. And that's another dystopian vision of a future society driven by eugenics. And potential children are conceived through genetic manipulation to ensure they possess the best hereditary traits that their parents had. Yeah. And there's a character in there, there's Vincent Freeman, who was conceived outside the eugenics program, and he struggles to overcome discrimination. I won't sort of give away the plot for people because it's very interesting, and it has an interesting message at the end, actually. But you get in there the whole idea of valids, where they have in the film, and what we know today, the flip side of that is invalids. Mm-hmm. And that's a very interesting movie. It was relatively early in all of this. Not too many people were talking about these issues, back in the 90s.
Yeah, I did see that movie in the 90s. I remember watching it, and at the time, it went a bit over my head because I was like, this definitely struck me, but I was like, boy, this is a weird one. It's a good example of a movie that you watch, especially when you're a younger person, and you take in the ideas no matter what, but it takes time to really, and maturity to understand what's going on. I think just in that sense, from that personal side of things, that's an important takeaway in that kids are watching a lot of, lots of movies and TV that do present transhuman ideas. They're not able to pick them apart in a way that adult does. However, they do subconsciously take in all the themes and memes that are in there. So it has a profound effect on them. So we have to understand that culture and media is a powerful thing, and we can't take it for granted, because if we do, the minds of ourselves and of our children are going to be, to a large extent, propagandized. I mean, it's true. A lot of people like to ignore what propaganda actually is, but it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And I'll also mention with the invalids thing. That's a term that, that's kind of struck me as something that we call people, and that is actually, it's saying it invalid. So they're invalid as a person, as a living thing. They are invalid, and that has eugenic connotations there. And the fact that Gattaca threw that in, they were probably playing on that word, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about a future where things are a bit more extreme than they are now. It's sort of the idea that, we don't live in a society where it's a case of, oh, well, if you can't walk, why would you want to live? That's not seen as an issue anymore. But certainly I've heard people saying, eugenics, maybe they wouldn't call themselves that, but eugenics advocates, that's what it boils down to. Well, this all has sound evolutionary roots, because there was a time when if you couldn't keep up, with the tribe, you'd fall behind and, get eaten by a predator, and that's just too bad if you weren't strong enough, or if you were blind and you couldn't function. But there is evidence of ancient societies, I'm not even prehistoric, pre-civilization essentially, of invalid people. I don't want to use that term. So let's say disabled people actually being looked after, because they found people with huge physical problems actually buried in graves at quite an age, with some of their possessions and stuff. So it was clear that the society that they were part of looked after them. They didn't just say, oh, well, you can't keep up, so you die. No doubt there were situations where that sort of thing happened, but it wasn't, it wasn't sort of that the Darwinian survival of the fittest. It seems that was not allowed to apply in all situations. Actually, we can make choices around these things.
Yeah, they definitely play up that whole the darker side of things there, and whenever transhumanists are making their argument and they talk about the past, you'll find that almost always the past was this horrible place where people died at the age of 22, and their entire existence through was meaningless and boring, and they were toiling 24 hours a day. It was always working, never any time for leisure, nothing like that. It was just the worst thing that you could ever imagine. Everybody stunk, stuff like that. And they were dirty. They'll even mention that kind of stuff. They're like, oh, look, we're all clean now and things are great and we live so long and we have health care. And it's always framed as that. And it's framed to make the transhuman argument. It's framed in a social Darwinistic way, in that everything's a conflict and that we would all kill each other if we were left to our own devices. And that's just not true.
This goes back to what we said in our last talk about, everything was smelly and horrible in the past, but we still have to take a dump. Wouldn't it be better if we didn't have to do that, Can we engineer that out of the way? So this also goes into not just human beings with physical problems or challenges or, things about their bodies that are not exactly how, not optimum, shall we say, into people's minds as well. And certainly the eugenics program very much would apply to people with mental, quote unquote, disabilities. I'm putting things in quotes all the time because I'm not happy just throwing the term out there, because I think it gets misused a great deal. I remember having explained to me quite an early age when I was a child, and there was a woman who lived next door and she had a child that wasn't her own. Actually, she fostered the child, and the little girl had Down syndrome. And I could tell she was different from everyone else. But there was a time when, and certainly there would be a time to come if certain people had their way, when human beings like that would be just quietly gotten rid of. And it just makes me reflect on how we judge different standards of what is valid and invalid, who should live and who should die. That little girl, I remember, was one of the most loving human beings I've ever come across. And that tends to be true of people with Down syndrome, this unconditional love thing. And just because someone is different, then where do the boundaries get drawn? And this is one of the big issues running throughout, this entire discussion really is who's to say what is good and what is bad, who lives, who dies, who calls the shots, and what's right and wrong about them, And again, in whose terms? It's a lot more complex than some would have us believe.
Yeah, I've had the same exact thoughts as you on that, Greg, and who's making the standards of what is desirable, what isn't, in any given sense of human existence. And on a culture creation level, this actually reminds me of the movie Lawnmower Man, where they take a guy who would be called by Julian Huxley or H.G. Wells a dullard. They take a dullard and they enhance his intelligence with technology. They use a brain chip. I forget what exactly the technology is, but he becomes super intelligent. And I think it's through the use of virtual reality exclusively. He uses virtual reality, and that actually expands his intelligence. And he goes within the virtual reality. He becomes a god there. So he becomes a god within the virtual world, and then other people go into that world, and that's his place, and he's playing his god games. But he came from humble beginnings. So that's an interesting film in that regard too.
Yeah, that's not one I've actually seen, but I'm well aware of it. You know, from many moons ago, probably turned the VHS cassette over in the rental shop. You know, when I was choosing something, but that's maybe something I should track down. I want to talk a little bit about this is a particular favourite of mine, a film called Zardoz. Now, first up, is that one you've seen?
Yeah, I have seen that one actually.
I think that a lot of people don't take this seriously because they look at it and everything about it seems wacky and out there. And I don't think they take it seriously. And I think there's some very interesting messages in there and some very interesting subjects touched upon. Now, for people who don't know, this came out in 1974. It's from director John Berman. I love all his stuff, actually, particularly the way he uses scenery. And he had a big hit prior to this with a film called Deliverance, starring Burt Reynolds and Jon Voight. Another film worth seeing if you haven't. But so he was basically, after that, he was given carte blanche by the studio to do a pet project. You know, just go mad, which he promptly did. And Zardoz stars Sean Connery, of all people. Again, I think he was keen to break the mold because he was already a big movie star at this point, particularly with James Bond, and he was, you know, keen to sort of not get typecast. And Zardoz is set in a future post-apocalypse Earth in the year 2293. And the human population, now this goes back to what we were saying earlier, has become divided into immortal, so-called Eternals, and the rest of us, which are the Brutals. And the Brutals live in a wasteland, and say this is post-apocalyptic, so they're out there just suffering and grubbing around in the dirt. And the Immortals live in something called the Vortex, which is this zone protected by technology. And they, of course, lead a luxurious lifestyle. But ultimately, it's an aimless existence, a very small population of these people as well. And the connection between the two groups is through the exterminators, of which Sean Connery's character Zed is one. And they are used and manipulated by the Immortals to control the Brutals, specifically by killing them. And that in itself is almost like sort of, I mean, you could see that as it's a bit cartoonish in the way that the visuals are done. But right there, you have this technologically enhanced elite living high on the hog, so it seems, but actually they're leading this dead existence, and everyone else outside just trying to get by.
Yeah, the existence of a leisure class, and then the lower class, which they don't care about at all. And it goes back to Greece a little bit. There was definitely the leisure class back then, and from that leisure class comes all the history and philosophy that we know of today from Greek culture, and all the famous stuff comes from out of that leisure class. But the reality that doesn't get talked about too terribly often is that Greece was a system that ran on slavery. That was like the backbone of their economy. And that gets ignored a lot of times because you're looking at the philosophy and things like that, that gets ignored. That's the truth. And with Zardoz, they had that flying head, the head that's flying around, and that kind of has a Greek quality to it. I don't know, as I remember, but it's been a while since I watched it.
If you look at the clothes that the Immortals are wearing, it's exactly like it's like a toga party.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I knew that it had the Greek feel to it from my memory. And then they throw in the whole Wizard of Oz, and Wizard of Oz gets into a lot of serious occult stuff. It's a highly occult movie, The Wizard of Oz is, and dealing in a more simplistic sense about human consciousness and dreaming and, the nature of true reality and the reality that exists only in the mind. Beyond that, people have kind of said that it's a mind control type film where it factors into trauma-based mind control, and it's actually used by people to trigger mind control victims. So there's that whole aspect of it too, which is highly disturbing. And they reference Wizard of Oz in the title, even that Zardoz just being the end of the Wizard of Oz, and Zardoz was kind of like, wasn't it a mystery that the main character is trying to figure out what Zardoz was?
Yeah, what basically happens is that Zed, as I say, Sean Connery's character, he eventually breaks into the vortex, and he works out that he's smarter than they realise, because actually Arthur Frayne, I think the character's called, who's actually behind the so-called god Zardoz, has genetically engineered him to be able to break in, because at the start of the film, Arthur Frayne is, my name is Arthur Frayne. I have lived for 300 years. I long to die, but I cannot because I am immortal. So he's brought about the destruction of his own elite society because he can't take any more of this eternal life. And the Eternals, Zed finds out that the Eternals are overseen and protected from death by something called the Tabernacle, which is just artificial intelligence. And of course the Eternals, as I said, they've grown bored and corrupt, a bit like the Eloi in the Time Machine. They don't need to procreate anymore, so all the men are impotent. They don't need to sleep anymore, so they meditate to try and get some peace of mind. Others, called the apathetics, fall into catatonic states and just lie there and do nothing. And for me, this is good because it's saying, be careful what you wish for in terms of, eternal life. But yet ultimately, the Arthur Frayne stroke Zardoz character, his genetically engineered creation Zed is encouraged to learn to read. This is something that the brutals generally don't do. Out in the wasteland, they've got more important things to think about than reading. But eventually you see Zed going to this dusty old library, and he finds, he's somehow led to this book, and he's looking at the cover, and it's the Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And you can see the cogs going in his head. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, Zardoz. And it's then he realizes what he's meant to learn, which is that Zardoz is not God. He's a manipulator behind the curtain. And that's, of course, exactly what it is in The Wizard of Oz itself. That's the big takeaway from that. So, and the film ends up with the destruction of the vortex and the tabernacle. And the closing scene is of Sean Connery, his Zed, actually hooks up with, I think it's Consuela. She was an immortal, or an eternal, rather. But once the tabernacle's destroyed, of course, they don't have that anymore. And the closing scene of the film is the two of them sitting together in what looks like a cave. But actually the mouth of the stone head, Zardoz. And then time-lapse shot is shown, and a child appears, and then grows up, and then disappears, obviously goes off to have its own life. And they're shown to age, and to die, and then to skeletons, to dust. And the message for me is kind of like that John Boorman's putting across, is this is how it's supposed to be. But of course, a lot of what we're talking about is a class of people, perhaps we should say a species, a breed of people, who think we don't care if that's how it's meant to be. If we can override this, we should.
That's definitely the transhuman idea there, that death is not only not desirable, but it's evil, and it should be undone. And yeah, that comes with a lot of consequences. So that just is obvious. But I guess it's not obvious to everybody, so it's good that movies like Zardoz are out there for people to watch and maybe think about that sort of thing.
Well, I would say that, obviously Sean Connery cuts a somewhat comical figure in his red pants, but if people can get past that, it's worth a watch. There's really some quite profound messages in there. That concludes part 1 of our interview. Be sure to tune in next week for part 2. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programmes offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Based on current audience numbers, if everyone who tuned in donated just 5 pence per show, that's about 8 cents US, this could become a full-time, fully funded operation, offering more and more often. During October 2014, over 50,000 of you streamed or downloaded at least one show. Total donations were £7 UK, which currently converts to about $11 US. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to LegalizeFreedom.com.
Utopia! Utopia. Utopia. Planet of your wildest dreams. Welcome to Utopia, where all your needs are catered for, anticipated, calculated. All your wants are monitored, program computer formulated. We know you will be very happy here. Nobody has ever complained. Yes. But we always encourage making utopian love. Welcome to Utopia. 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 Welcome to Utopia.